everyone. Welcome to today's 451 Alliance webinar, Enterprise IoT Outlook 2022, What's Working and What's Not. My name's Andrew Cranen. I'm a membership manager for the 451 Alliance, and I want to begin by extending a major league thank you to our Alliance members for participating in our quantitative surveys and our qualitative interviews. These contributions of knowledge to our studies serve as the bedrock for the insights and analysis we're able to deliver to you today and through all our written reports as well. And presenting today is Rich Karpinski. Rich is a senior research analyst at 451 Research, and he tracks, analyzes, and anticipates the pace and direction of IoT adoption. In that role, he's responsible for smart city and smart spaces coverage and the evolution of mobile operator business models as well. He comes to us today from his office in the windy city of Chicago. Good morning, Richard. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, to all our participants today. As Andrew said, I'd like to thank every one of our Alliance members for all of their assistance this year. A big part of my job is fielding these surveys and working through the results, and we'll be presenting a lot of data and hopefully some insights as well today as we walk through some of our latest data from our Alliance surveys in the IoT area. So we'll look at some of the latest trends and data around adoption, around infrastructure, including a look at various pieces of infrastructure and the impact that IoT is having on things like connectivity and storage and compute, and also the edge, which is a big topic this past year. And then we've got some budgets and spending data. And I think the way that when I was putting this together and the way that I think about this for our Alliance members is I think this is really interesting data to see what your peers are doing and thinking, do a bit of benchmarking, right? And also where I can, I'll call out best practices. So I think to benchmark against best practices and approaches and attitudes and adoption strategies around IoT that look to be best practices as they contribute to digital transformation and overall enterprise and business competitiveness and growth. I think is the best way to be thinking about our data and our time together today. So let's jump in. What I wanted to do first is we'll have a couple of polls and so to get a flavor of the audience, and then we'll share some of our larger polling data against these sort of spot polls, right? So the first one, which hopefully you'll see on your screen, is what impact, if any, has the COVID-19 pandemic had on your organization's IoT initiatives? And it's, the options are slowed or halted, accelerated in particular to address some of the issues around the pandemic, or this idea that you've largely stayed the course, right, that the impact was minimal. And so we'll leave this up a second, let Andrew track some of the responses before we move on. As we're doing that, and Andrew, feel free to step in at any point, I do want to, some of the questions we have around the pandemic, I mean, we're asked mid-year with the idea that we might be seeing post-vaccine and post some of the waves that we had seen, some relief. I'm not sure if anybody can say that today. We're in a little bit of an uncertain time. So when we say post-COVID, think about it at least post early days, right, and uncertain days of the pandemic, and we'll take all of these questions with a grain of salt. So Andrew, how do we look? I don't know if Andrew's on mute, but I think I'm going to forward this. I think we've had enough time to see the responses. So largely stayed the course is the top response. I didn't bring our exact responses to this question to bear today. We've asked this specific question in the past, and the responses were very similar. It's good to note. We did not see a major halting of projects, right? We did see a slice of respondents in our larger surveys that are accelerating and using IoT to tackle some new problems. And so that brings us to our first slide here today. The idea that IoT, as we've seen it from our Alliance member responses, it does have potential as a tool for post-COVID. return to work. So there are some clear opportunities around, environmental monitoring, employee and public health monitoring, and just overall digital transformation. Some things around being able to work with customers in new way or work with your supply chain in new ways. And so just this slide here, there are three different attitude questions we asked to see about the degree to which our alliance members agreed with these ideas. And you can see here to the right, starting off with, once we're post-pandemic or at least on a better course, will IoT be a high priority? Now, understand these are IoT respondents, right? So we are cherry picking folks that are actively involved with IoT. And you can see here, it will continue as we can say continue because we didn't see a bunch of halting, but it will be a high priority coming out of whatever wave we finally get out of, right? Is a strong response to the idea that IoT technologies can play a key role in helping enterprises be more effective, operate more efficiently, or respond to some of these issues. And then we asked this question about monetization because I think as we've looked at drivers, and we'll see a little bit of that today, of IoT deployments, they're often more around internal efficiencies, right? They're inward looking often. There is opportunity to leverage IoT data and insights more towards the top line. And if not monetizing specific processes, at least feeding that data into something that grows revenue. And you can see here also some strong belief that there is some opportunity to leverage enterprise IoT to monetize new commercial products and services. So again, it's an overall strong continued view of the sector, even amid the challenges we've seen in the past few years. And in that sort of middle box, you can see we did some cutting, right, and some looking deeper into these questions, and especially around this idea of IoT being a priority coming out of these challenging couple of years. You can see the groups that's over-indexed to. So larger companies are more likely to say that's the case. Those with large IoT budgets are going to see continuing to spend and leverage that into IoT. This idea of tech leaders and digital leaders, companies that are self-identified as comfortable with new technology or executing a digital transformation strategy, are seeing themselves coming out of the pandemic, even doubling down. And so I think all told, it's a good starting point for our conversation today around the impact of IoT and its ability to sort of weather the storm via these last couple of years in terms of continued work by our alliance members. As I mentioned, I wanted to share just some of the baseline figures around some of the sort of core elements of IoT. So here is just a look at the types of endpoints, IoT endpoints that are typically being where data is being drawn from, most aggressively or most widely, and you can see I didn't necessarily bracket them out this way, but if we start from the top, you can see, we survey an IT audience here, so it's not surprising that there's keen interest in pulling data from what are traditionally IT endpoints. But then you quickly move into things like cameras, not only surveillance, but also a bit of video analytics, building structures and access control, environmental. So you see sort of censoring buildings and working environments, led by IT sorts of equipment. We get down to the middle, and we begin to sort of splinter into more specific, and as we go down the list, into sort of more next generation types of endpoints. So, clearly within some organizations, if you're in transportation or manufacturing, there's been some aggressive censoring of the supply chain, which is needed more so now than ever with some of the challenges in that area. And then when you get into some areas where things like robotics or drones become critical and really powerful in terms of the data they can either be driven by or return, it's much more niche oriented, right? And so I think this gives a general idea of the types of endpoints we're seeing IoT data drawn from. not only the types, but it's interesting to just get a sense of the scale of all of this, right? And scaling questions are hard. I mean, our alliance members range from small to very large companies. So, just to get a sense of the average, the average enterprise today is sort of deploying and drawing data from around 5,000 IoT endpoints. So even that average size it's a very large endeavor to be tracking and managing and connecting all of those endpoints. Even more, that goes up to 3% of our respondents are managing 50,000 or more endpoints, and even a small handful are managing up to 1 million endpoints. So these are projects, depending on your environment, where there's just massive scale we're talking about here. The other thing is we're also still seeing very strong growth from the number of endpoints. We saw on the last slide the types of endpoints that can be brought into the fold. The average increase over the next 2 years, we asked our respondents to look forward. So that average of 5,000 endpoints, the average growth is 84% additional endpoints over the next 2 years. And so again, just from the sheer data endpoints and the data flows, we'll talk more about data flows in a second, you can see we're still in a relatively early stage here with a lot of growth and a lot of enterprises still putting a lot of IoT endpoints onto infrastructure. Okay, so what types of use cases are those endpoints and all that IoT data enabling? What I'll say here is that we sort of look at use cases in two ways. We have other surveys where we look more at a particular vertical, right? So the key use cases in manufacturing are obviously not the same as in healthcare or in smart city. The use cases are very industry specific. What we're looking at here is what we sort of called horizontal use cases. So use cases that span multiple industries. And I think these are important to think about in two ways. When we talk to our vendor clients at 451, we often talk about these kinds of opportunities as sort of build once, deploy across multiple customer bases, and so that's of a lot of interest. And I think from our vendor conversations, some of the top use cases that seem to be of interest to them because they see a lot of uptake and interest are things like asset tracking. Every industry has assets that can in some way be tracked and more efficiently leveraging IoT sensors. Things like predictive maintenance, organizations and industries that have machines in place can gain great value from censoring them, and so they're able to more predictively understand when they might be going out of service and keep them in service. That's a great value and a great cost savings if that can happen. And so again, as we look across these use cases, I think they map pretty closely to the endpoints we saw on the last slide. And again, so what to do with this data? I think either taking a quick look and a little quick run through this today, or we send you guys the deck and you can dig in a little bit. These are some opportunity areas I think you can look at for ways in which your peers are leveraging IoT data to drive some value across their organizations. Okay, so let's look at some different pieces of infrastructure and the trends around those pieces. So obviously, connectivity is a key enabler of IoT data and use cases. And so we see here on the left this very broad range of the different types of potential types of IoT connectivity and the timeline for adopting them to date in 2 years. We've been seeing this across a few years now where 5G is being said to be in use and also planned to be in use. Honestly, a little more aggressively and broadly than is probably even available today as an IoT connectivity network, right? So a lot of the use of 5G and the deployment of 5G by operators in support of massive IoT scale or super low latency, ultra low latency types of applications is just coming online. So I think more than anything, we see this as an element of awareness and interest in 5G as sort of a very strong force, not only for wide area and public 5G services, but increasingly there's a lot of interest in sort of campus-wide private 5G wireless. And in a continuum, you can do much the same thing with private 4G and LTE, which you see right underneath that. Some of the low power alternatives are NB-IoT or LoRa. Both here domestically and even more so in certain geos like Europe and elsewhere. Those are not going to go away. They have very unique characteristics around low cost, low power that make them a good alternative to what will probably be a bit of a higher cost, often tilted towards private deployment 5G. So, as much as we expect this list to kind of change and evolve over time, I think we can begin to see the outlines of what things are going to look like. And then, the reason for using 5G for IoT or considering it, it's interesting. We'll see this in a couple of different ways where it's often very pragmatic, pragmatic things that drive decisions around IoT, whether it's what connectivity service to use, or we'll see some edge decision making later on. While we often talk about things like ultra low latency for edge and 5G, really advanced services around network slices or integrating 5G plus MEC edge computing. Those get a lot of the headlines. It's often just very much more practical considerations around, okay, I need this level of resiliency, or when we talk later about edge, I need to not be sending massive amounts of IoT data back to my data center or out to the public cloud just from a cost perspective or a data sovereignty perspective. So it often, a lot of these decisions often come down to very practical considerations we've found. So in addition to connectivity, there's major impact on all of this IoT data has on data storage and compute requirements, which we'll see in the next slide. So we've been tracking the impact of IoT projects and all of the data that these endpoints generate on enterprise data storage. And you can see in the little line chart in the gray box, we've been tracking this over time. And those numbers there are the percent of overall enterprise storage, data storage utilized for IoT. And you can see just the mountains and the waves of IoT data that get generated have a very large impact and really have the potential to gobble up massive amounts of enterprise storage. So there's a couple of ways that enterprises we've seen are tackling that challenge. One is to do more edge compute and edge tasks to make sure that the only data that's moved out of that initial sort of insight or analytics or trigger point, right? That initial analysis of that data, what gets moved to the next level of storage and maybe long-term storage or near-term storage is only the data that's really required. So that's sort of one step to minimize, but even in the face of trying to minimize all of that data, you can still see consumption and utilization going up over time. The other thing is just to have access to more dynamic storage capabilities, right, and storage capacity. So on the chart on the right, if you look at the light blue bars are 2017 and the dark blue bars are 2021, you can see the decline in IoT storage or plans to add IoT storage at what would be a traditional data center, and the increase in moving it into places that are more dynamic, right? That can be added and spun up on demand, that are priced on demand. And so that includes the cloud, including IaaS and PaaS types of infrastructure, an emerging edge that's delivered as a service rather than on-prem hardware, and then managed third-party services such as SaaS. And so all of those different options that are more dynamic, and that can feed into a more dynamic sort of business and enterprise environment driven by all of this IoT data. That's definitely the second trend to deal with just the onslaught of data that happens when you turn on these types of projects. The other thing we've been looking at and talking to our vendor clients about is the need for compute, right, and where the compute needs to be and what the level of compute that's required. Again, this is only going to continue to be a challenge, both in the amount of compute and the sort of the power of compute as what happens with IoT data, and particularly at the edge, moves from simple sort of sensor tracking, data tracking, into something that's more analytics driven, and in particular that's trying to pull data and then execute AI and ML models, right? You just move into a completely different level of compute requirements. And so we just started asking about these questions around compute for our audience, for our alliance members, and you can see even in the initial year the requirements are viewed as going up. And again, where we see the largest amount of growth is in cloud or cloud types of compute. So public cloud compute, telco edge service, both are look like to be strong growth areas. And then that IoT gateway with compute, is the edge, right? So while we're definitely seeing edge as a service, there's also just a need for beefed up server instances on site. So things that were previously IoT sort of aggregation gateways with a minimal amount of compute are now frequently being shipped with a relatively large amount of storage and compute to be able to do those edge tasks we talked about, and do them efficiently, do them well, and make decisions around IoT data at the edge, and then send upstream only that data that's necessary. So just like storage, compute, it can be a challenge as these projects scale and grow. And then finally, from an infrastructure perspective, we spend a lot of time talking to enterprises and trying to understand their venue decision choices. And then this has been an area of keen interest for IT vendors and service providers as well, as they try to understand where the workloads need to land, and then the requirements to support those workloads. And so we typically, and I'll share on the next slide a little more deeply, we tend to think about three broad areas, right? So edge being on-prem, very close to or attached to the machine or sensor, near edge, which is growing in interest and importance. So performance-wise, it feels like an edge, but it's not sitting on-prem. It could be at a local tower, it could be at a local data center instance, and just the availability of high-speed connectivity turns those near-edge environments into sub-millisecond types of responsive environments that literally work and feel like an edge. And then we talk about the core, which is the data center or the cloud. And again, I mentioned this when talking about connectivity. It's the more pragmatic concerns that tend to drive IoT execution venue decisions, right? So cost and availability. Where are we gonna be able to fit our IoT infrastructure requirements into our budgets? As it scales, what can we do to not send too much data or excess data to the cloud where it needs to be transported and stored and drive up our costs? So along with cost, what's available, right? Where do we have infrastructure available to support the kinds of IoT processing we need? So not only is it affordable, but simply is it available if I'm in a disconnected environment, or if if I'm in a location where we're not always able to have infrastructure in place on site. what is the story for accessing the necessary infrastructure. That second level of decision making is really interesting. It becomes around, okay, we've got infrastructure deployed. How do we secure it? How do we manage the data? How do we deal with environmental concerns? Again, if you're in a rugged environment, these are all really important inputs into the kind of decisions that enterprises need to make about where to execute IoT workloads. And then when we get down to these last sort of triggers of decision making around venue, it's always an interesting conversation with our clients because these are the considerations that they tend to promote in their marketing and around their solutions, right? If you talk to a telco or if you talk to an edge service provider, the top of the story is around ultra low latency, right? Or high performance requirements in a manufacturing environment, right? And the way we look at these is if you have those needs, I mean, it's just undeniable. It's a yes, no. If you have an ultra low latency kind of environment, if you have a robotics environment, or you have some sort of real time enterprise kind of need, it's yes, no. If it doesn't work, then you're just literally not going to be able to deploy it. Those kinds of use cases and environments, I think, are still fairly rare, right? Where you're looking at really sub-millisecond performance, when you really need to have really high levels of availability and resiliency. In most cases, it's just not necessary, right? You can have you can return data and analyze data within a day. You can the latency requirements are just not there, so you can make a back and forth round trip to a data center or a cloud instance, right? So that's the way we sort of look at the way these. And the way we hear from all of you that these venue decisions are made, which are really critical because not only do they impact where enterprises put their infrastructure, how they spend and budget for these to support IoT infrastructure and projects, but also increasingly there's a needed level of orchestration with sort of modern IT practices. And so you have to take that into account as well. If you're really building a multi-tier infrastructure to support not only your entire enterprise, but these IoT applications, that needs to go into your thinking as well. And so I'm going to throw up this chart. We tend to sit on this a long time with a lot of our clients, and it's a lot of data, right? I understand, but if you just take a look at it, right, and I'll try to draw out the trends. That middle column is where IoT workloads get initially stored and analyzed, and then the right column is sort of secondary, whether it's historical or just some sort of secondary analysis. And these are I think what do we have here? 10 typical venues or locations, right? And then we roll them up into what I described before as core, near edge, and edge. And so if you look at those core, near edge, and edge lines, right, you can sort of see the breakdown at a high level between these different types of venues. And so what you see here is, from our alliance surveys, 38% of workloads are deployed in the core, 29% at these near edge locations, 32% at edge. So there's a couple of things to understand around those numbers and to sort of take into your own considerations around how you build out infrastructure. I mentioned this idea of near edge and edge blurring as far as performance is concerned. And so when we talk about the growth of edge and the importance of edge, the attached or the on-prem or the sitting next to the device or the sensor edge is not necessarily growing by leaps and bounds, but what's happening is the near edge and the edge are blurring, and together those are now the dominant venue, the dominant location for IoT execution. I think we add those up. 61% of initial IoT execution is being done at either a near edge or edge location. So there's that need to do it right off of the device, to do it if there are low latency requirements, to do it to make sure you're able to throw out the data you don't need and only move the data you need down to that next level of storage. When we look at the core itself, right, which today has the largest percentage of IoT processing, the biggest growth area has been in the public cloud. So there's just a lot of gravity from leveraging the cloud and IaaS and PaaS services in other parts of the organization, and leveraging those same relationships and that same type of infrastructure into IoT. And so I think, we see this in other areas where we look at, say, IoT vendors, the IoT vendors, leading IoT vendors, leading IoT platform vendors are the public cloud players, AWS and Azure above all. And we sort of see this again and again. So while the edge is critical for IoT, and it makes sense because that's where the data is being generated from, and a lot of the decisions need to be made right at that point of the edge, it's the cloud where, and again, this is much the same as we see in other parts of enterprise IT. It's the cloud that's making the biggest gains when IoT data is moved into a more centralized location. So with that, I'll sort of end this sort of piece on IoT infrastructure. It's been very interesting to run these surveys over time. I didn't share a ton of year-over-year data, but we have that, and it's been interesting to see the trend lines. But it's more than anything, it's a core part of how we do our research to be able to talk to all of you as Alliance members and get your plans and attitudes around this IoT infrastructure. So it's been, really helpful, and we're really thankful to get this level of data and granularity from our Alliance partnership. So a quick thanks there, as all of this sits in the center of what we do, how we work with our clients, and how we work with all of you. And so in the second part of our time together today, I just wanted to take a little look and share some data around IoT budgets and spending. Again, to give you some benchmarks or comparisons by company size or by industry or by maturity level. I think it's very interesting. There's also, I think, some very interesting trends around how services and products are bought in this area. It's happening all across IT, but it's very interesting, I think, in the IoT area in particular. So once again, we'll start with a poll to get sort of a spot sense of things. So the question here is, what is your organization's preferred method for paying for IoT infrastructure and applications? Select the best response. So CapEx, traditional upfront payment for IoT products and services. OpEx, more pay-as-you-go for IoT services consumption. And then outcomes, the idea that you would pay as you go, not for the infrastructure or products, but for agreed upon IoT business outcomes. So this has been an area of interest as we talk to clients, as we talk to enterprises. So we'll be interested to see what our group today says about this, and then I'll have some data to share from our larger surveys around the trends in these areas.
Looks like we've got some responses coming in, Rich. Let's give it another few seconds.
Okay, sure. And I'll tease these a bit, right? So as we're waiting, we have been talking about the idea of outcomes as being very central to IoT business models and infrastructure models. But it's been a little slower to come than we might expect. In some ways, not surprising. It's a big change. So Andrew, with that tease, are we ready to go?
I think we are. About 50% have responded. Let's fire away.
Sounds great. Thanks. And so, well, actually, the outcomes, which I hinted at as being a little slower on the uptake, and we'll see that later in our survey data, fared fairly well here, and really strong support here for OpEx, which I think clearly has become with cloud a preferred way or an optimal way of purchasing infrastructure. And as we talked about earlier, there's so much dynamism and growth and processing and performance requirements with IoT data. I think that idea of OpEx and a service-driven as a service approach to IoT infrastructure certainly makes a lot of sense. So hold on to these thoughts. We'll come to this specific question in a bit here within our time today. But those are interesting responses. So just to walk through some budgets and spending. Again, this is a very data-heavy chart, but I'll walk you through some of the highlights. So hopefully we can get some takeaways. The average budget size, again, we're talking about different sizes of companies. So this is really then averages out and is useful more than anything from a comparison point of view, right? So, $6.5 million average budget size. Again, I don't want you to take that as faith, right? But let's use it to compare. Not surprisingly, larger sized firms can almost double that budget, right? So these are projects that really can generate a lot of data and require a lot of infrastructure and can grow very quickly, especially as projects move out of trial into more broad scale implementation. So it's not surprising to see larger firms spending more. There's an interesting thing around maturity level, right? So in a couple of different ways, and I'll share this data, these instances, it looks like from our responses, there's a touch more spending that's done at sort of the early stages of a project, right? So here we got digital laggards, learners, and leaders. So where are you in your digital transformation journey? If you're not on it at all, you're not spending as much, if anything, on IoT. If you're in that learning stage, which I think might map to a trial or POC stage, so you're in the early stages of deploying IoT, you're likely to spend a little more, surprisingly, than someone that's maybe more fully executing. I think it has to do with the amount of upfront infrastructure and work that has to be done to launch these very complex projects, right? And when you get into more of the production mode or the operations mode, there's some ability to not to seeing the actual annual spend pull back slightly, right? As you scale, then that's going to counteract that, but there's a lot of upfront cost more than anything. And I think if we go down to the bottom, right, we see this again, where we look at in consideration and in POC being slightly higher on average budget sizes than in production. It's sort of another take on the same thing. And then these different infrastructure models, right, whether you're building and owning your infrastructure versus whether you're consuming it at an IaaS or PaaS, or whether you're strictly consuming it from a SaaS perspective. It's really interesting numbers there. You can definitely save money, and you see smaller budgets in consuming as a service options for infrastructure. The big number there for SaaS is kind of interesting. I actually haven't dug into it as much as I'd like to, but a couple of things would come to mind. I mean, if you're just consuming services rather than owning that infrastructure, there can be a higher marginal cost for those types of services, right? That big number also implies that, at least for our survey, there are some big firms leveraging those kinds of services, which is interesting, right? I think IoT SaaS services can make sense for large, complex organizations. But I think what we've seen more than anything is those kinds of organizations move away from cloud-first approaches to something that's more hybrid or on-prem, just because there's so much processing and infrastructure required, and it becomes so mission critical you want to own it. And then some of the long-tail SaaS is around smaller firms that have to fit in the value chain. So that's an interesting number, something for us to watch over time. But consider that sort of a baseline of budgets and spending, sort of like how much is being spent, right? Our budget's growing, right? And so again, we've been able to track, with all of your help, enterprise IoT budget plans, expected growth over the next 12 months, looking forward for some time now, right? And we saw a nice, strong ramp up from 2016 to 2019 of larger and larger expected growth, larger percentages expected growth. Slight pullback into 2020, right, which is and into 2021. So it would be a 2020 look into 2021. The idea being not surprising to see a little bit of pullback from COVID. And then again, if you we dig down into the expected budget percent growth, sort of demographics, right? You see that there's larger growth expected in that adoption status bar or line for in consideration in POC than in production, which is interesting. Again, there's a fair amount of growth or spend required early in the process of getting these projects off the ground. So we asked those who are increasing their spend and who are decreasing their spend sort of why, right? To get a sense of what's driving more spending and what's driving a pullback. And so on the increases, not surprisingly, I think early success and planned expansion are the biggest drivers of increased spend, right? So moving from POC or trials into full-scale production, or having success with initial projects, and then expanding teams and efforts to include new projects, and then subsequently needing additional infrastructure are sort of the biggest drivers of additional expense. That's all very good, right? If you look down to the bottom, the idea of costs being greater than expenses has not been the driver. So these are good reasons to be spending more, right? Seeing success and adding new projects. The drivers of decreased spending, if we think about where we've been in the past year, we see. Remember, it was a smaller number overall, right? So, but we do see some firms that are having to shrink IT staffs, or are delaying projects either to pandemic or accompanying economic uncertainty, which is not surprising. We all are aware of situations like that. Thankfully, the pandemic has, we've been able to stay out of something like a recession that causes a broad pullback. But clearly, as we saw earlier, there are some instances where that's the case. And if we sort of dig down into the side data there, among the groups that was delaying due to COVID uncertainty, were 83% of those or were in POC with IoT, right? Those that were in POC with IoT were more likely to cite COVID uncertainty as a reason to pull back. So it goes to which is interesting. I think I think if we sort of put a couple of these slides together, the pause may have been most felt among those companies that were just starting to work things out in a proof of concept, right? And then we're hit with the uncertainty of the past few years. And so it'll be interesting to see as we look forward into the new year, how this changes and what the level of confidence and the level of move ahead with some of these projects are. And we'll be looking to survey about that in the coming year. A couple of final sort of budgets and spending questions, right? So we get asked all the time by our vendor clients, who holds the budget reins, who's doing the spending, where's the money, right? And again, think about this from your point of view as peering, right? So understanding benchmarks and best practices. And so what we've seen consistently, and it's been sort of a theme within the IoT area, is that while vendors who serve or service providers who serve the market, and then enterprises themselves who want to take as much lag and friction out of these processes, there needs the operations teams in industrial sectors, the line of business teams in sectors like finance or retail, they need to be brought to the table, right? And so if you're a vendor serving this market, or if you're an IT person within a large organization, you need to understand the business needs, requirements, and the way that IoT could be used within your particular industry and within your particular company. It's extremely critical that there's some collaboration and a meeting of the minds around IoT deployments, even more than other types of technology and application deployments within organizations. It's just critical. At the same time, when it comes to budget and who's doing the spending, we see again and again who's also responsible for this infrastructure, who's responsible for projects and vendor relations. It's typically the IT department. Now, again, this makes sense because what's being purchased at the highest level is IT infrastructure, right? Is systems, is storage, is connectivity, is compute, as we talked about before, and that's going to typically flow and be managed by an IT department. And so we see here, we run separate surveys of IT decision makers, which is the blue bars, and OT decision makers, operational technology decision makers, which are the orange bars. So we can do a little compare and contrast around their thinking of who's in control of budget, right? So for the top chart here, we're looking at contributors to budget, so there could be multiple contributors. Both IT and OT indicate that the IT department is the biggest or the most significant or the most likely to be contributing budget, right? And then if we look at the primary contributor, it shifts a bit, right? So again, the IT department is seen as the most likely primary contributor. But when we look at the OT respondents, they're more likely to cite their department or a line of business department as being a primary contributor. So, I think again and again we've seen a lot of the spend and budget comes from the IT side. There are certainly organizations where things are more. I look at manufacturing in particular, where there's a long history of technology spending and application, where there might be in place budget for this. And then I think we're also seeing a blending of roles and business groups and business units where operations technology teams and IT technology teams, some roles are beginning to blur, teams are coming together, and decisions are being made at a group level where it's a more of a blended environment. So I think even more than understanding that IT holds a lot of the budget reins is this idea of moving towards more of a blended environment for both decision making around spend as well as application priorities, et cetera. Okay, so this is we can compare and contrast our internal or our little spot poll earlier. So what's the preferred spending approach? And we asked this this past year, and we asked for a forward-looking view as well. And as you can see here, there was little change viewed over time, which is surprising. And there was also not much interest or awareness around outcome-based approaches. So our poll today was a little different, right? The outcome was slightly different than this. And I think we're very interested to see how this evolves over time. And our goal is to dig into this idea and maybe ask some follow-up questions and maybe be a little more clear. I think some of these terms are new. Even the idea of CapEx versus OpEx isn't necessarily, is certainly something that's coming new in terms of how to think about that for many IT departments, and clearly outcome-based. And so the idea of outcome-based is that in many industrial firms and many places where there are operational technologies deployed, manufacturing execution systems or logistics systems, there's often this kind of contracting and relationship where there's more of a payout based on an SLA or some sort of outcome. So if there's an agreed upon level of quality indexing within a manufacturing environment, or if there's some other sort of business outcome that can be measured, then compensation to that provider is based around that. And it seems to make a lot of sense in the IoT area, where all of the infrastructure is really, and all of the applications are built to deliver a business outcome, a very specific business outcome. So we may be very early in this. Our spot polls showed little outsized interest, but I think we'll be very interested to see if this continues to evolve and grow over time. And then finally, we did this is sort of just the teaser of where spending is. We tend to dig down in our surveys and go a little deeper, but for today's survey, I just wanted to give a sense, again, from a benchmarking perspective, of where the spending priorities are. And so the blue bars here are just overall spending, like where are you expecting to spend money in the next year. And so the percentages would be the numbers of companies that are spending, the percentages of companies that are spending on these areas. And then the orange bar is the largest category. And as you can see, the the overall spending in the largest categories are tracking fairly closely, right? There's nothing that's too surprising. I will say that over time, what we've seen go up the board are the operating expensive and the professional services, so 2 and 4. And I think that again speaks to the maturity level and the growing move of these projects from trial sizes and toe dipping sizes into something that's more production oriented. That's when you get into ongoing operating expenses, and often professional services help begins to grow at that time as well. From top to bottom, from an IT systems and infrastructure perspective, we always see a lot of spending in and interest in and prioritizing of IoT security, and then top down from there, you just kind of get the most mission critical types of IT platforms. So IoT platforms and applications, data center compute. That's an interesting number where it's a little closer between the category and the largest category. So, not surprisingly, again, if the trend is to move IoT processing into cloud instances, and to grow it at scale, it's not surprising to see that as being a top category. And then as we get towards the bottom, we get closer out to the edge where devices are typically less expensive, or the ARPU for around connectivity is sort of per connection is lower. So the overall spend is decreasing, but the importance of spending in those categories is obviously very foundational. So with that, I'll wrap up. Just a few sort of takeaways, right? And then we'll take some questions to round out today's session. So, more than anything, I hope you can see that sort of IoT enabling infrastructure requirements are both growing rapidly and evolving rapidly, right? So we saw sort of the evolution around connectivity towards 5G. We talked about the evolution of edge, near edge, and cloud or core, and the sort of as a service approach, not only taking hold within cloud and IaaS, IoT infrastructure, but also beginning to come to that near edge with sort of data center private edges and telco edge offerings. So there are more options tuned to specific enterprise requirements than ever when it comes to IoT infrastructure. Spending on that infrastructure and the deployment and the projects that are sort of consuming that infrastructure has slowed ever so slightly. It looks to us during the past couple of years during this pandemic. Very good news that there was not a major pullback. These are very strategic projects that we can see them thought about in that way in other surveys where we look more around metrics and expectations and business drivers. But you can see it in the budgets as well. Budgets have been fairly strong and held. And then, this idea, these are very complex projects, so you can see the many types of infrastructure that need to be required. We've done some work around the number of vendors and the types of vendors and how those vendors are managed. I didn't share all of that today. But just the idea of managing these projects and managing all of the vendor relationships and the budget, and then also those vendor relationship management largely falling to the traditional IT departments, really sort of reinforces the idea and the prominence of the IT department within these IoT deployments, right? We hear so much about the line of business or OT side, but the IT requirements are high, especially as things scale, and the role of IT is extraordinarily central, and the role of IT vendors and service providers is as well. And then all of this, I think, is just generally good news for the sector, right? We see projects being closely tied to large digital transformation efforts. We see budgets holding. We see the role of IT being really central again. And so all of this positions the IoT sector not only for it as a level of importance within the enterprise, but also as sort of an incubator for next generation use cases, ways of doing business, ways of buying technology and deploying technologies. All of these things are happening within the IoT sector, I think, as a leading edge, and then will be flowing throughout organizations. So again, I think it all positions IoT very strongly, even coming out of what has been a very tough time. And so with that, Andrew, I will wrap up our main presentation and be happy to take any questions from the audience.
Excellent. Hey, thanks for your presentation, Rich, and for a great look at 451 Alliance research results. Very, very interesting. Before we turn to Q&A, folks, I want to quickly remind you to take part in that very brief exit survey on today's presentation. Our thanks for that. Okay, we do have a bit of time to field a question or two. Let's see what we got. There is a question, Rich, about a slide that I will pull up in a moment.
Sure.
There's a reference to 54% of enterprise storage being occupied by IoT projects. And the question is whether that is across the board or relative to specific verticals. Let me go back to that slide.
Sure. But before I speak, I'll wait to see it as well.
I think it's this one.
Yeah, so 54%. That's across the board, right? And so there's two things to think. I mean, it's a big number, right? So there's two things to think about. These are respondents to our IoT survey, so they are vetted in as deploying IoT, right? So immediately it removes any respondents that are not active in the area, so that over indexes a bit for those that have IoT data requirements, and often fairly large ones. But yeah, that is across the board. I obviously didn't take a look at the verticals in this particular slide. We'd be happy if there's a particular question around vertical. I'd be happy if this person would want to maybe reach out. We could maybe share some data around a particular industry.
That's a great offer, and I can connect you if that interest emerges. Here's another one. What's the number one issue that holds back or stalls IoT deployments from your perspective? And what should firms deploying IoT look out for?
Sure. I think I sort of mentioned this idea or these ideas earlier, but the number one thing I think is the need for alignment across an organization. And so, the getting all of the stakeholders to the table. So it's going to vary from industry to industry and company to company. But think and understand that ultimately an IoT project is delivering some sort of business process improvement, right? There's somebody in the organization that owns that business process metric, that their career and their raises and bonuses are going to rely on it. And so they need to be at the table. If they have not come up with the idea or brought the idea to the table, they at a minimum need to be there. And then we need to get the right IT people to the table, right? We need to get the head of infrastructure. We need to get the security team and the CISO, and we need to get the data scientists, the analytics teams. And so these are projects that as we saw in the list of spending categories, cross a lot of different types of products and services, a lot of different teams. And so getting that aligned up front has been like the number one best practice and indicator of successful projects from an ROI basis. Most likely, if a company is moved into production out of POC, they're most likely to be aligned in that way. Our digital leader group is most likely to be aligned that way. So I think above all, that's the thing to do. And I don't know if we have any vendors or service providers on our call today. I think this is more of an enterprise call, but we often talk to our vendor clients about the need to help enterprises get everyone to the table and get that alignment, because their number one issue that we've heard is just challenges getting to revenue right? And just projects being stuck in POC. I didn't bring any data around this idea of POC purgatory today, where IoT projects, due to their complexity, due to the lack of alignment, due to some at times unwillingness to invest at a C level without having that alignment, they can get stalled, right, at that small point. And when they really need to move to scale and deliver a lot of value, without that kind of alignment, it is often where they will stall. So I think that's the number one issue, Andrew.
Rich, we're 1 minute past time. Can you stick around to answer one more question?
Sure.
Just came in. Excellent. Folks, if you need to drop off, we completely understand. Thank you for being here today. Do take a moment to complete that exit poll. We will wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes as soon as Rich addresses this question. A slide mentioned AI at the edge to reduce the compute load in the cloud or data center. Where would that AI code run?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think I mentioned this idea of the IoT gateway moving from just being kind of a pass-through or aggregation point into more of an execution environment. So if you look at some of the leading hardware vendors, and I won't name names here, but you know the names, what was traditionally a gateway now looks much more like a pretty beefed up server. And there may be even some HCI instances where I get deployed at the edge. So can often be fairly significant server power at the edge. So that's one place, and those servers are being optimized to deploy machine learning types of algorithms. The other thing is this idea of the service edge, right? And so again, thanks to better connectivity, whether it's connected, sort of hardwire, sort of wireline, or if there's some 4G or 5G access to an edge location, these as a service instances that are not directly on site have some very strong capabilities, compute capabilities to run AI algorithms. And the idea that the edge is becoming an extension of the cloud instances we see of IoT platforms. And if you look at an AWS or an Azure or a GCP, there's obviously a ton of investment and movement around AI, supporting AI at that level of the infrastructure. But those pieces, those cloud instances are being extended out to the edge in large part to make AI execution and inference and even training sort of move back and forth from edge to cloud pretty dynamically and as needed. So this idea of edge AI, I think about edge in that bigger way, right? It might not necessarily be on a server sitting next to that computer. It could be in a local data center, right, or a local cloud service, and that's certainly a strong environment to do to have the kind of power and performance that AI requires.
Excellent. That brings us to the close of today's presentation. Thanks, folks, for sticking around another few minutes. Thank you, Rich, and a sincere thank you to all of you for contributing your voice to this research. Watch for a recording of this webinar and the slide deck, which will be emailed to all 451 Alliance members tomorrow. If you have questions about the Alliance, you can reach us at 451alliance at 451alliance.com. Our Twitter handle is at 451alliance. We hope you found this presentation valuable and that you can join us for future 451 Alliance studies and webinars. A very happy and safe holiday season to everyone on this call. Thank you again, and so long for now, everybody.
Thank you.